Hi, I'm Scott at ediblemusic.com. Transients are very useful to understand for editing, for aligning and warping. They're useful for balancing, and they're especially useful to understand how you approach things like EQ and compression. But what is a transient? When you imagine someone hitting a drum, they use their drumstick, they swing down, the stick hits the drum, and then there's a resonant sound of the drum that comes afterwards. The transient is that initial hit on the drum. What it's described as more scientifically is a change of state. So a drum can't make a drum sound on its own. It requires something to be hitting it. And the transient is the thing that signals the change of state of the object that's making a sound. So they happen very fast. They signal the onset of a sound, and then it transitions into more of a sustained or a resonant sound afterwards. We hear them in combination with each other because transients happen very, very quickly. But what they're useful for our ears is to identify the location of a sound. It sort of signals, oh, a sound is about to happen right now. And then we pay attention with our ears more to the sustained sound, which is interesting because usually a transient is louder, but we don't hear it as louder because our ears focus more on the sustained sound and because the transient is usually gone by the time our ears give attention to it. Here's a good example with the triangle. And you can see just looking at the waveform that the very beginning of the sound is the loudest part, and that's the part where the triangle is being struck. And then it rings out, and we have the resonance at the end. But if we zoom in, and I'll separate that out, that's the transient sound. Just this little tick, and then our ears hear the rest of it as being much louder. The sustained part is much louder, even though technically the loudest part of the sound is that transient. By the way, I love a triangle in a song. They're so useful to establish a sense of rhythm, especially if there are no other percussive elements going on. When you hear a triangle coming in, even though it's a very light sound relatively, there's not a lot of boominess to it, of course, but it establishes a sense of rhythm. And so every time a triangle comes in, I can just start feeling the groove there. So I dare you to put a triangle into one of your next songs, and I bet I'll love it. I want you to show it to me as well. But a triangle is a very good example because it contains that very distinct transient information. And transients will announce that a sound is about to happen, and it directs our hearing to identify and differentiate sounds that are occurring in the mix balance. So you can apply your knowledge of transients to your editing because the workstation that you're working with, if you're doing any aligning or warping, the markers that the DAW will want to look for are transients because then it can create these cuts where you can stretch or move things around a lot more easily. They're useful for your mixing because when you are EQing, you will find that the transient information that knock on whatever the object is, whether it's a guitar string or whether it's, our mouths create transients as well. Usually the phonemes that don't require our vocal cords. If you're using if you're making like a P or a T sound, then there's a very clear transient there as opposed to just going ooh or ah. It's also a really good idea to listen to other music and analyze and assess how those songs balance and manage their transients. I talked about this a little bit before. It's super important when you're listening to reference tracks. So I'll put that video up at the end here. Now you can think about sounds as a composite of both the onset and the sustain phases of a sound, the transient and the note that occurs afterwards. As you're balancing then, you can look for the transients that you want to be emphasized, whether it's the drums or the vocals or a guitar. If you want to emphasize the transients, you can look for it around there and boost that area. Or if you want to de-emphasize the transients and pull the instrument more to the background of the arrangement, then you can use EQ to de-emphasize the arrangements, and it will have the effect of allowing other transients to occupy the foreground while that instrument will move more towards the background. Compression will be engaged by those transient peaks. So if you have an attack time that allows the transient to come through and then the compression engages, it will move the sustained part of the note down and it will bring that transient out. Conversely, just like as you would with EQ, if you had a faster attack time, it can tamp down the transient, and that as well will help to move the instrument backwards or forwards depending upon how you'd like it to be arranged in the mix. Again, transients are louder, but we don't necessarily perceive them as louder, so they can be difficult to assess in the mix. Our ears give more attention to the sustained notes, so if we hear someone strumming a guitar, the sound of the pick hitting the string will be that transient information, but our ears tend to give more attention to the note that's being played. But now that you can begin to think about sounds as a combination of the onset and the sustain part of the note, then you can get a better understanding of how to integrate transients into your mixing techniques and how to use transients in order to add more depth and more clarity and more detail to your mixes overall. Have fun.